Is Milet Shamir, and I'm Vice President of the university in charge of international affairs. I want to thank everyone for making time to be with us today. I know many of you haven't gotten much sleep in the last few days, whether because you're physically here in Israel, spending time in shelters each night, or because you have people that you care about in this region. Maybe this is a good opportunity to thank whoever is in charge of launching missiles, that they timed it perfectly so that we can begin at 8 o'clock as planned. Let me share with you for just a moment that here at Tel Aviv University, the past few days have been extraordinarily busy as we've been working around the clock to ensure that everyone in our community is cared for, whether this means our students who need to complete the school year on schedule, or members of our community who suffered direct hits from the attacks, from our staff and students who are stuck abroad and are unable to return to Israel, and also are doing our best to assist the international community here on campus with their needs. So we have many challenges here, but fortunately or unfortunately, we already have much experience here in Tel Aviv in dealing with emergencies. And so here we are. Part of what we see as our mission in times such as those is to share with our community and to share with the public at large the significant expertise that we have here on campus when it comes to the Middle East and the geopolitics of the Middle East. So I'm very glad that we have a top-notch speaker who will be addressing you tonight from our faculty. But before I introduce our speaker, let me make just a few short procedural points. First, please note that this session is being recorded. Secondly, we want this session to run for about an hour. So what we intend to do is to leave ample time for Q&A. So thank you all of you who sent questions in advance. We will try to get as many of those questions as we can. And you're also invited to put questions in the chat below, and hopefully we'll be able to get to many of them as well. And finally, let me just say that in the case that sirens will sound again here in Israel, we will end this session, and if needs be, we will reschedule it for another day. Our safety, of course, is our main priority. And now I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Brandon Friedman, who is a colleague and a friend, a senior research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies here at Tel Aviv University. Dr. Friedman is a member of the senior staff in our faculty of the Humanities, and he's been a lecturer with Tel Aviv University International programs for a very long time, I believe around 15 years already. I'm also happy to share with you that this summer he will be teaching an online course on the Middle East here at the Lowy International School. So if you're interested in that, ask us about it in the chat, and I'm sure Brandon can say a few words about that as well. But for now, our topic is Iran and Israel and the current crisis. And Brandon, let me turn the podium over to you, please.
Thank you, Milet, Professor Shamir, for that very generous introduction. And let me start with a few prefatory remarks of my own. Before I forget, let me thank Professor Shamir for the invitation to be with you all today. Let me thank you all for making time out of your busy schedules to be here. I also want to thank in particular the TAU International team, Maureen Meyer, Roz Raucher, David Ryan, and Orit Koti, for all of the hard work that they put in organizing this event on very short notice. So thank you all for making this happen. As Professor Shamir pointed out, we're teaching an online intensive summer course that begins on July 7th and continues to August 7th on the regional politics of the Middle East, from the Arab Spring to the Iran-Israel war. For those of you who find the content or today's talk interesting, there'll be a lot more of that over the span of 1 month, 3 times a week online. So for those of you who are interested, I invite you to turn to the International School for more information. If you're looking for more resources on the war and more commentary analysis, I would encourage you to visit the Dayan Center website, dayan.org. Many of my colleagues have a lot of interesting work to share on various aspects of the current war. that may go beyond some of my remarks tonight. And so for those of you who are looking for more expert commentary and analysis, I highly recommend the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. Finally, just to reinforce or underscore Professor Shamir's remarks a few minutes ago, for those of you who are in Israel, if there's an alert from Home Front Command, please make sure you put your safety first. We all want to make sure that everyone is okay. Okay, Iran and Israel. I'm going to frame my remarks today in terms of questions, some of which mirror or reflect the questions that many of you sent in. I think it's the best way to get at the heart of what we're all concerned about with this ongoing war. And so I'm going to start with why it was that Israel attacked Iran, and why is it happening now? So Israel's head of the National Security Council, or National Security Advisor, Chafi Hanegbi, outlined a few days ago 4 specific goals for Israel attacking Iran. And I'll just briefly outline them. First is that Israel was interested in damaging Iran's nuclear program. I would argue that the way to frame that is to say setting back Iran's nuclear program substantially. And we can talk about the difference between that and destroying or eliminating Iran's nuclear program. The second goal was damaging or striking Iran's ballistic missile program. For those of you who are in Israel, the Iranian ballistic missile threat is very real, and this was a threat that Israel felt was no longer tolerable. It was a threat that Israel experienced directly both in April and October of 2024, and so destroying or severely damaging Iran's ballistic missile program was a second goal or objective. It's also important to point out that there were real limits recommended to be placed on Iran's ballistic missile program under UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which was part of the former nuclear deal with Iran. They were non-binding in the sense that there were no real enforcement mechanism behind them. But the ballistic missile program, or Iran's ballistic missile development, was always being treated by the international community as being on par with the nuclear program. And principally, that is because ballistic missiles are the preferred instrument of delivering a nuclear weapon. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The third goal for Israel in the current war is destroying or attacking Iran's ability to launch a multi-front ground war against Israel. For those of us who have been living through the October 7th, 2023 war from then until now, it's quite clear that Iran's war with Israel is not Iran's war alone. Iran and its militia partners in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, and of course in Gaza and the West Bank. And there was a concrete plan, or there is a concrete plan that Iran has to launch a ground invasion of Israel. And I think that part of what the ongoing war aims were to degrade or take away that option for Iran. The fourth stated war aim for Iran was creating the conditions for stymieing or thwarting Iran's nuclear program, and perhaps setting the stage for a diplomatic deal with Iran that would force Iran to ultimately give up key aspects of its nuclear program. We may be beyond that at this point, but it may be a little bit too early to say. And so those were the 4 aims for Israel launching the war about 5 days ago. And the question is, why now? Okay. And that gets more to the heart of the question of Iran's nuclear program. And this is a controversial issue because the feeling in Israel, as stated publicly numerous times since the war began on Thursday night, Friday morning, was that Iran was getting close to what experts refer to as a nuclear breakout, being able to make a dash to assemble a nuclear weapon, or 10 to 15 nuclear weapons, if you will. And this was a scenario that for Israel was simply intolerable. And that Israel felt that if it waited any longer, it would be too late to stop Iran's nuclear breakout. Now, what we've seen play out in the press since then is a debate between various intelligence services about whether that Israeli assessment was a correct assessment. I think we'll continue to see that debate play out as the war continues. To date, Israel has not officially shared the raw intelligence that its assessment was based on, though in a minute I'll explain why it was a reasonable assessment, and one that we can obviously discuss. Before I move forward to the second question, I think it's really important to discuss briefly the timeline of Iran's nuclear program. And the first thing to understand is this is a 40-year-old challenge. Iran's nuclear program began in 1984, 1985, when Iran turned to a black market Pakistani nuclear arms dealer named A.Q. Khan, who had stolen key technical information to help create Pakistan's nuclear program, and was there selling both blueprints, information, other nuclear key nuclear technical information on the black market to those who were interested in having it, and Iran was a buyer in the mid-1980s. Iran's nuclear development continued with support from China and Russia in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And it was between 1998 and 2002 when the current Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had basically consolidated his power in that position. It was a process that took several years in the 1990s. The program accelerated. And in 2002, there were several important dimensions of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and primarily the facility at Natanz, which was revealed by the Iranian opposition in exile in 2002. And that really triggered, you could say, an international effort to rein in and confront Iran about its secret nuclear development, which was in violation of its nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations. And this sort of started the nuclear saga with Iran that's continued for the last 23 years. There was some sense during the George W. Bush administration between 2002 and 2007 that the Americans would seek to stop Iran's nuclear development, but the Americans became bogged down in the Iraq War, and slowly that option receded as a realistic American goal. It's important to point out that at the end of the George W. Bush administration, Israel destroyed Syria, Bashar al-Assad's secret nuclear program in Syria. And also the Americans and Israel launched a joint secret operation known as Olympic Games, which was basically a cyber warfare operation to sabotage Iran's centrifuges in its Natanz facility. Natanz was the undeclared secret facility that Iran had built in the late 1990s, early 2000s. During the Obama administration, the Americans were very keen to find a negotiated diplomatic solution to Iran's nuclear program. During the early years of the first Obama administration, the Iranians weren't cooperating. The Americans placed heavy economic sanctions on the Iranian nuclear program right around 2010, and Israel launched a shadow war against Iran's nuclear program, which really escalated between 2010 and 2012. And you could say was an important element of the pressure brought to bear on Iran and its nuclear program that ultimately led Iran to enter into a process of negotiations with the Americans between 2013 and 2015. I would also add that an important dimension that convinced the Iranians to negotiate, in my assessment, was the fact that the Americans led the military effort that overthrew the Gaddafi regime in Libya in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring uprisings there. And I think the Iranians were concerned that Obama, despite articulating a desire for diplomacy and a negotiated solution, had demonstrated the capacity and the will to overthrow Gaddafi's regime in Libya, and this concerned the Iranians. Between 2013 and 2015, the Americans in the Obama administration, along with the Iranians, negotiated what became known as the JCPOA, or the nuclear deal, which put time-sensitive restrictions on certain important dimensions of the Iranian nuclear program, but that these time-sensitive restrictions expired in a fairly short period of 10 to 15 years, which didn't leave anyone comfortable with the fact that after 10 or 15 years, Iran would be free to pursue its nuclear aims. For those of us who believe Iran's been trying to develop nuclear weapons, that meant that after 10 to 15 years, Iran would presumably be able to develop nuclear weapons. Ultimately, when Donald Trump was elected and into his first term of office, he found the JCPOA, or the nuclear deal that Obama had negotiated, as being a weak one. And in May 2018, he left the nuclear deal with Iran. And this basically put us in the current phase of conflict with Iran over its nuclear program that we've experienced since 2018, which is that there are no restrictions or constraints on Iran's nuclear program. Iran has remained a bad actor in the Middle East, an actor that supports a strategy that has created what some have called a ring of fire around Israel's borders. Iran has, since its inception as the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979, professed as a stated aim the elimination of Israel. And so Iran's ability to develop or continue to make gains with respect to its nuclear program since 2018 became a source of increasing concern here in Israel. And you could say that this concern increased with the October 7th war, because Iran, I think, was accurately viewed as being very much involved in supporting Hamas in launching the October 7th war. And certainly Iran backed and pursued that war through its militia partners in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen since October 7th. And so I think, as a bottom line to the question of why now, I think the Israeli assessment was it could wait no longer. Iran was very close to crossing a point of no return. And in a minute, I'll address why. So the second question, I think, that has come up repeatedly since the current war began is, why was Iran moving to nuclear breakout? If Israel's argument is that Iran was approaching a point of no return with its nuclear program, was approaching a point in which it was putting itself in a position to build 10 to 15 nuclear weapons, what was Iran's motivation for moving in that direction now? And I would argue there were two main reasons. First is Iran's war against Israel in support of Hamas since October 7th has been a failure, and Iran is at its, prior to the current war, was at its weakest point as a regional power. And the reason is that Iran's strategy regionally for confronting Israel was based on two main pillars. One was its militia partners, or what many people refer to as its proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Hashd al-Shabi, or the Shia militias in Iraq, the Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza, and various other smaller groups in the West Bank, along with the Houthis in Yemen. That part of what Iran was trying to do is surround Israel with armed militia partners ready to deter Israel in creating what it was hoping would be a favorable balance of power for it in the region. And the second component, which is related to this, part of what it would also refer to as its forward defense strategy, was arming its militia partners, or these proxies, with precision missiles. And what a former high-ranking Israeli general referred to as the Koreanization of Israel's borders, creating a situation on Israel, particularly Israel's northern borders, where there would be hundreds of thousands of missiles facing Israel's largest population centers and critical infrastructure. And I think that this was part of what Iran was banking on would keep Israel at bay as it continued its nuclear development. Both of those elements of Iran's forward defense strategy received serious blows during the post-October 7th reality. Hezbollah was dealt a serious blow by Israel's, as part of Israel's war beginning in October 2024. And Hezbollah's capacity to be used as an Iranian deterrent was severely eroded by Israel's military operation beginning really in September, October 2024. The second failure or weakness that Iran experienced was on its two major ballistic missile attacks against Israel in response to Israeli assassinations of key Hezbollah and Iranian figures. what we saw was basically an Iranian ballistic missile capability, which was limited in its capacity to damage Israel. And this we experienced, for those of us in Israel, firsthand on April 13th and October 1st of 2024. And so there was some sense that the two core elements of Iran's forward regional strategy against Israel, its ballistic missiles and precision missiles, and its militia partners along Israel's borders in Lebanon, Iraq, Gaza, West Bank, and Yemen, had failed. And therefore, Iran believed that it more than ever needed its nuclear program. And that's why Iran was inching closer to crossing the nuclear threshold. The second dimension here has to do with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Organization's increasing concerns about the direction and verification of Iran's nuclear program. The head of the IAEA over the last few months and arguably the last year or so has been issuing a series of reports and findings suggesting that it is increasingly difficult to verify key dimensions of Iran's nuclear program, and suggesting that Iran's nuclear program is moving in a direction that should concern the international community. And these are messages we had not heard with this kind of tone and substance from the IAEA in years past. And I would argue that the IAEA's reports and findings support Israel's assessment, which the current war is based on. Even since the war began, the head of the IAEA, Phil Grossi, has made several statements suggesting and supporting Israel's concerns, or at least some of Israel's concerns over Iran's nuclear program. So that my comments up to now address why did Israel attack, why now, and why was Iran now moving towards a nuclear threshold or a nuclear breakout. The third question I want to deal with is, what has Israel done since the war started? From an operational perspective, and I want to be careful here because I'm not an operational expert. There are a lot of other people who have much more experience and wisdom on these issues, but I think it's important to understand what Israel has done and where it might be going from here, because a lot of the questions were addressed that we received prior to the event were addressed at those issues. So first, the first thing Israel did was severely damage or actually eliminate Iran's capacity for air defense. And it's why you've heard several senior officials, both internationally and in Israel, refer to, and the US president himself, refer to Israel as having control over the Iranian skies or Iranian airspace. Israel succeeded in a very sophisticated operation in the first 48 hours in eliminating Iran's air defense. It's important to point out that one of the things Israel previewed in response to Iran's attack in October 2024 was Israel's capacity to eliminate Iran's air defenses. And that was Israel's way of sending a message to Iran after Iran's October 24 attack. And so I think Israel delivered on that count, and I think it's an impressive military achievement by Israel. Secondly, Israel eliminated 4 of the senior-most military commanders in Iran, something that was almost unthinkable prior to October 7th, and decimated basically Iran's leadership, military leadership decision-making for at least 24 to 48 hours. Israel also killed several of actually 10 to 14, based on the best estimates I've seen, of the leading Iranian nuclear scientists, those most involved in the leadership roles in helping Iran weaponize its nuclear program. And to add to that point, Israel also destroyed both the digital and hard copy institutional repositories of Iran's nuclear development. And so there are those who have argued that an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear program doesn't destroy Iran's nuclear knowledge. Even eliminating those nuclear scientists responsible for the program doesn't eliminate the knowledge base that Iran has developed. I would agree with that to a certain extent, but I think Israel's also taken steps to destroy the institutional repositories of knowledge with respect to the most sensitive issues. And that's certainly an important step. in reducing Iran's ability to reconstitute or rebuild its nuclear program in the aftermath of the current war. For those of us who've been living through Israel's nightly, or not Israel, Iran's nightly ballistic missile attacks, Israel's also targeted Iran's missile stockpiles and Iran's mobile missile launchers. Control of the skies is important for being able to do that. And I think based on my amateurish assessment, it looks like Israel is having some success in reducing Iran's capacity to launch ballistic missiles at Israel. Finally, the last and perhaps the most important element of Israel's military effort has been its effort to destroy or damage or degrade Iran's physical nuclear infrastructure. The IAEA has already reported Israel's success in destroying or largely destroying the thousands of uranium enrichment centrifuges at Natanz. There were estimated to be upwards of 45 to 50,000 centrifuges there, several thousand of which were of the advanced models and therefore very capable. Israel, importantly, no less importantly, from my perspective, also carried out important strikes on Iran's Esfahan nuclear uranium refining facility. Why is that very important? It's at the Isfahan facility that Iran mills uranium, takes uranium and turns it into hexafluoride, which is the fuel that gets fed into the centrifuges to produce fissile material. So without Isfahan, the ability to produce the feedstock that Iran uses to enrich uranium to weapons-grade material becomes much, much more difficult. Now, obviously, it's important to point out that Iran may have another secret milling or conversion facility that we're not aware of. But the most important nerve center, the one that allows it to produce nuclear feedstock or uranium feedstock in large quantities, was severely damaged by Israel in recent days. So that's a brief assessment of what Israel has done over the last few days. What remains to be done? Okay. There was an important article published yesterday by Jay Solomon, an American journalist who has very good contacts with the American intelligence community in the free press, arguing that Israel's timeline and military plan for Israel's attack was well understood in the United States, that so far things have gone according to plan. But there are three important things that remain to be done. And the question is whether they will be done. The first is Iran's most impregnable or nuclear infrastructure that is buried thousands of kilometers underground in the side of a mountain at Fordo. Israel has not attacked yet. And that is considered to be a place that if the current Iranian regime survives this war and Iran was looking to quickly reconstitute its nuclear weapons program, its facility at Fordo would provide it with an important site for doing so. And so many people have argued that for Israel to feel confident that it's accomplished its mission, it would need to somehow address or damage the Fordo facility, which it has not done yet. And there's been a lot of talk that part of what's going on right now is that Israel is trying to enlist the Trump administration for American military help or support in attacking the Fordo facility. And so it remains to be seen whether Israel will attack the Fordo facility alone using its own military capabilities, or whether it will be a joint attack with the United States, or whether Israel will ultimately decide that not to attack it at all. That's a question mark. And I think it's an important point to keep in mind over the next 24 to 72 hours. The second aspect of the prospective military plan that hasn't yet been acted on is Iran's principal oil infrastructure, oil exporting site at Karg Island in the Persian Gulf. This is the nerve center or the center of Iranian oil exports, and that should it be attacked, it would cripple Iran's economy. Israel has not yet attacked Karg Island. In a minute, I'll explain why that is a very sensitive issue, not just for Iran, but also for Iran's Arab neighbors in the Gulf, and that could be part of the reason why Israel has yet to attack it. And finally, the third and last element of any prospective military plan is whether there'll be calls for regime change in Iran, whether the US will call for the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow the current regime, whether the US and or Israel will target the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, whether the ultimate endgame here is to leave the regime intact, but yet somehow convince it coercively to surrender, or whether the aim is to create the circumstances in which the regime collapses and the Iranian people choose a new regime to replace it. That point is extremely important, extremely sensitive, and it's not yet clear what the plan moving forward might be. That addresses the question of what remains to be done. I would like to now briefly consider, and I know time is short, and Millet, feel free to remind me of it, but I think this is a really important question, so I just want to take a minute to address it before we get to other questions. If Israel has yet to address Fordow, the bunkered underground uranium enrichment facility, or has yet to attack Karg Island, or seek to target the supreme leader, will Israel be able to enlist the United States in actively supporting it in doing any of those three things? And I think what we're seeing is what we've seen from the United States, and I would say we've seen it over the last few months, but we're seeing it rather intensively now, is that the Trump administration is putting itself in position to give itself that option. The Trump administration, or in particular, US President Donald Trump, has yet to make a decision about whether the United States wants to join Israel in attacking Iran. Now, let me just briefly consider what I see the Trump administration's considerations as. First is, I think the Trump administration came into office, particularly during the second term, with a very strong no more wars agenda, that Trump ends wars rather than starts them. And in particular, Middle East wars is a particularly sensitive issue in the American political establishment, on both sides of the aisle. And there is an important dimension or important component of Donald Trump's administration that's supported by a camp that does not want to see the United States enter into another war. And I would say that there are two important people in that camp in the administration. One of them is Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., and the other is the Vice President, J.D. Vance. And J.D. Vance sent out a very interesting tweet yesterday, which sort of made the point that this is Donald Trump's decision and Donald Trump's decision alone, and he'll support him whatever decision he takes. But to a certain degree, he was also distancing himself from that decision. The second consideration is one of legacy and history. How does Donald Trump want to be remembered? And here, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, had a very important tweet on social media yesterday in which he sort of alluded to Trump having an opportunity to be Harry Truman, 1945. And here the allusion is to Harry Truman's decision to attack Japan and end World War II, which was a nuclear attack on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It's a very interesting and charged historical allusion, but an important one. And finally, if we're talking about how Donald Trump wants to be seen in terms of legacy or history, he's someone who came into office talking about wanting a Nobel Prize for ending wars. He wanted to get deals done. He wanted to get a deal done with Iran that would sort of help him get a Nobel Prize. And so this question of how Donald Trump wants to be remembered can cut either way. He can see himself as wanting to be remembered as a peacemaker, or he can see himself as wanting to be remembered as the person who eliminated or destroyed Iran as a nuclear weapons threat. And so what comes next, I think to a large extent depends on where the United States and where Donald Trump sees himself. And I think I'll leave that point there. In terms of what an Iranian defeat would look like, short of regime change or removing the supreme leader from power. Donald Trump yesterday tweeted out two words: unconditional surrender. And so I think there are 4 points that would really constitute an Iranian surrender. One is it would have to give up enriching uranium on its own soil, which is a key component of developing nuclear weapons, or the key component of developing nuclear weapons, or extracting plutonium and being able to turn plutonium into a fissile material, which is a second path to nuclear weapons, which no one has really talked about in recent days, but Iran also has a latent capability to do that as well with its heavy water nuclear reactor at Arak. The second, Iran would need to end its ballistic missile program. Ballistic missiles are widely understood as being the main delivery system for nuclear weapons. And so an Iranian surrender would mean giving up that program or dismantling it. Third, Iran would have to end support for its proxies around the region in other neighboring states, in particular Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and for Israel in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank. And so I think that's a third component. And a fourth component would be, and for us in Israel, perhaps the most important, Iran would have to give up its stated goal of destroying Israel. This, first and foremost, is why Israel finds the Iranian nuclear program such a big threat. That for 45 years, Iran has declared its desire to see Israel eliminated. And so I think if we're looking at what an Iranian defeat looks like, giving up its revolutionary aim of destroying Israel needs to be part of the component. Iran may not opt to surrender, and that's an important point to remember. It may decide it wants to continue the fight. For Israel, this would be an ugly scenario. It means that there would be a lot of chaos and uncertainty regionally moving forward. There are some people who believe Iran could conduct a crude nuclear test now. That would also be an alternative and a dangerous scenario that I hope we are able to avoid. And finally, the last scenario that goes along with an Iranian surrender is there's an option for Iran to give up its revolutionary posture, to seek regional diplomacy and regional economic integration. And I think that there are a lot of Arab states in the Gulf that are waiting for that, that they don't need to see the regime overthrown. Many of them probably would prefer not to be overthrown because they prefer the devil that they know to perhaps the devil that they don't. And I think that many of the Arab Gulf states would like to see a reformed, defanged Iran integrated economically into the region. I think I'll stop my opening comments there and maybe turn to some of the questions that I haven't yet addressed.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon, so much for this comprehensive and informative and insightful briefing. We have a lot of questions on the chat. We also have some questions left over from what people sent before. And maybe I'll just try to group a few questions together each time. And the first one I would say is, I'm going to ask you to do something that no serious scholars like to do, which is to really speculate on a bunch of things in the near future, because we've had a lot of questions that are asking, what would be the geopolitical ramifications of this war. Specifically, people were asking about the conflict in Gaza. How is it going to be affected by what's going on now? The idea, which was still somewhat on the table, that we may have some kind of an agreement with Saudi Arabia. The question of the Houthis, what would be the outcome? And maybe to kind of wrap it all up in a single question that somebody posed, I think, very eloquently, what are the best and worst outcomes of this conflict in terms of our relation with other actors in the region?
Sure. So I'll speculate and just do what scholars do in response to all speculation, is say that if there's one thing I've learned as a historian, it's that our best efforts at anticipating what might happen are usually limited at best and futile oftentimes. But I'll say that in terms of a best case scenario, if Israel succeeds in accomplishing all of its aims and in one shape or form, Iran surrenders, this would obviously mean, as part of a surrender, one of the things I suggested was that Iran would have to withdraw its active support for its partners across the region. This would open up the opportunity for a reset for Israel, both regionally and potentially opportunities to explore a different vision for the region. Now, this is, you're, as a scholar of the Middle East, you're optimistic at your own risk. And so I think that the best case scenario is that the period of de-escalation and normalization, which we saw between 2020 and the October 7th war, resumes in some way, shape, or form, and we begin to see the region move in baby steps towards diplomatic and economic integration, and perhaps that includes Iran. It also means that states like Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and the Palestinian territories have an opportunity to decide their own futures rather than have Iran and Iranian partners decide it for them. The worst case scenario, as I see it, is that Iran chooses not to surrender, that it takes Israel a longer period of time to accomplish all of its goals than it has so far, which has seen Israel make some tremendous, impressive gains on the battlefield, and that we see Iran choose to resist in a way that seems against every one of its interests, but nevertheless, it's an ideologically motivated regime that's unwilling to give up its revolutionary identity and ideology. And here it's important to remind ourselves that Iran fought an 8-year war with Iraq between 1980 and 1988. A war in which Saddam Hussein sought a ceasefire from 1982 forward, and Iran chose to carry on and continue fighting despite every signal that it was losing that war, or at best fighting a stalemate. It was also a war in which Iranians were attacked regularly with chemical weapons, and yet the regime chose to fight on rather than surrender up until 1988. Now, the big difference today is that Iran is much more challenged in terms of resources. The international sanctions regime on Iran, which has really strangled the Iranian economy over the last 10 to 15 years, makes me wonder how long the Iranian regime could hold out, even if it wanted to continue fighting, even if it was losing that fight. So I think it's important to recognize the precedent of the Iran-Iraq war between 1980 and 1988, but also realize this is not the Iraq war of 1980 and 1988, that Israel doesn't share a border with Iran, and therefore Iran's ability to strike Israel, given the distance, is much more limited, and the constraints on Iran's material resources today are much greater. So I think those are the best case, worst case scenarios. Gaza. I don't think I addressed, and I think that's a really tough question. How is all this going to influence Gaza? I'm a bit pessimistic on this count, because Hamas has demonstrated, or at least those who are fighting in Gaza, to be also equally ideologically motivated. And with every material sign on the battlefield indicating they're not only losing, but causing the non-combatants to experience enormous suffering, has not cowed Hamas into giving up or surrendering. It's also been an enormous challenge for Israel to locate the remaining hostages or the remains of hostages in this enormously complex network of underground tunnels that Hamas has built. And I don't think defeating Iran is going to reduce that challenge. It may put greater pressure on on Hamas's political leadership in Qatar. It may ultimately Qatar to put a kind of pressure on Hamas's leadership that perhaps it has not yet exerted. But I think at the end of the day, the question of whether Israel can or can't return those hostages is going to be something Israel is going to have to accomplish independent of the Israel-Iran war. And so the linkage there exists, but I don't think it's necessarily a game changer with respect to getting the hostages back. Though I hope on that count, I'm absolutely wrong.
Thank you, Brandon. I hope you're wrong also. Let me ask you a different question that we received. You talked for a few minutes about Trump and his perspective and his interests, but a question that was raised is, if there is an American involvement, if the decision is made by the Trump administration to enter the war, what would that look like? What would the US be doing in actuality in their operations?
I think the key difference maker here, and the reason why this has been an issue both publicly and privately, I suppose, is that the United States has B-2 bombers and bunker busting munitions that Israel doesn't possess. And from the expert opinions that I've seen and heard, um, that American munitions and stealth bombers will be able to destroy the Fordo, or have a much better chance of destroying the Fordo facility than Israel would alone, given Israel's capabilities. It doesn't mean that Israel can't do the job alone. It just means that together with the United States and the United States's Air Force and munitions, the chances of success are much higher, and the chances of efficient success are also much higher. And so I think that that's the crucial decision that is being discussed, is whether the United States will join the war in an active way and use its B-2 stealth bombers and bunker busting munitions to destroy the Fordo facility.
Thanks, Brendan. There are also several questions in the chat, as well as the questions that we received earlier, that have to do with something that you discussed in the beginning of your briefing today, but maybe you can expand a little bit on that. And that is kind of a certain skepticism, both in Israel and especially around the world, over Israel's claim that Iran was very, very close to fulfilling its nuclear mission. There are several questions here that want to ask you whether how do we know that that is true, as well as how can we treat statements like that were made 10 years ago, 12 years ago by Israel, but didn't materialize. How can we not be skeptical about the claim that was made now? Now, I know you already talked a little bit about that, but maybe you can expand.
Sure. It's a critical question, and the short answer is we don't know. And we won't know until the moment in which the raw intelligence in which that assessment was based on is made available. What I suggested in my opening remarks, and I'll just briefly elaborate on it, is that I think one of the reasons I'm comfortable supporting the Israeli assessment is the IAEA's reports in recent months, and the head of the IAEA's comments are something we hadn't seen before, which suggested that the IAEA itself was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of Iran's nuclear program. And Iran's nuclear program is close enough so that the question of whether it's days or months, and I think the head of the IAEA didn't take the possibility of it being years away as a serious one, means that Israel's window of acting was a narrow one. And so, to my mind, it's the IAEA reports. And by the way, those are publicly available. For those of you, you don't need to take my word for it. You can read them yourselves on the IAEA website, where they're freely downloadable. Now, they're written in very bureaucratese language, so you sort of have to read between the lines and parse what they're saying. But if you also watch some of the recorded statements that are available, both in recent weeks and even in the last few days, it's quite clear that the head of the IAEA, who's no Israel advocate, right? He's supposed to be an impartial scientific judge of what the Iranian nuclear program looks like based on the best available information. He was deeply concerned. And I think that supports the Israeli intelligence assessment. I'll just make one last point with that respect. There was news stories today, the Americans saying the Iranians were still years away. There was a national intelligence estimate that the Americans produced in 2007 saying that Iran gave up its weapons program in 2003. There's been some revisions to both of those claims. And only several weeks away, the Iranian opposition in exile released critical information suggesting that there is an active nuclear weapons program that was restarted in 2009. And for those of you who are skeptical or doubtful of the Iranian opposition's information, it's the Iranian opposition in exile that revealed Iran's major nuclear infrastructure that the world was basically ignorant of in 2002, the Natanz facility, which is the biggest Iranian uranium enrichment facility that Israel attacked in recent days, was revealed by the Iranian opposition in exile in 2002. So I take their report seriously, even if one needs to verify their information as well.
Thank you. I want to bring up a question that, again, was raised in different versions from our audience. People who are asking you to perhaps try to take into consideration or to explain to us more the Iranian point of view. Specifically, there is a question here about the reasons why Iran was so hell-bent on destroying Israel for so many years. How popular that view is among Iranian society. And related to that question is also some questions about a potential regime change and what kind of regime can we anticipate would replace the one that we would hypothetically be toppled. For example, one question that we have in the chat is it likely that the Shah would return, or some version of that older regime would be instated? So a few questions lumped together. Take it in any direction you want.
I think it's hard to overstate how much anti-Zionism and anti-Israel is a pillar of the Islamic Republic of Iran's revolutionary ideology. Ayatollah Khomeini was the leader of the revolutionary movement that overthrew the Shah in 1979. In a series of lectures he gave when he was in exile in Iraq, one of the very first that became the foundation for his notion of Islamic government in Iran. The very first lecture is basically a diatribe against Israel as being a force in the midst of the Islamic world that has split the Islamic world and prevents Islamic unity. And so I think that the opposition to Israel is sort of built into the regime's ideology, the ideology that the governing elites in Iran have grown up with, and is a core component of the regime's legitimacy. Now, one could argue that the Iranian population now is still fairly young, although the demographics are shifting. They're getting older. They're now, I would say, the large demographic in Iran is entering middle age. So many of them don't have a living memory of the revolution the way perhaps earlier generations did. And one could make the argument that their revolutionary anti-Israel, anti-Zionism fervor is not the same as the ruling elites. And that might be a fair argument. To be honest with you, I have no idea if it's true, and it's a very difficult thing to measure when you're sitting in Israel. I'll only say this, that the Iranian people have risen up against the regime continuously over the last decade, and the regime has brutally suppressed almost every expression of freedom, the most recent being a very inspiring movement led by women in Iran beginning in September 22, where women were rebelling against the regime's diktat to wear a hijab in public. And so the question is really, where does the revolutionary ideological opposition or motivation to attack or delegitimize Israel, where does that stand within Iran? I think it remains a pillar of those elites that make up the governing apparatus of Iran today. And where the people stand on these issues is an open question, and one that remains to be seen. If there were a regime change, what are we likely to see? So first of all, I think the regime change scenario is one that we should approach very conservatively. There's always a grain of wishful thinking, whereas we anticipate if Khomeini, the supreme leader, is killed or removed from power, and the Iranian regime is overthrown, that a regime that somehow better will take its place. And I would caution us all into thinking that that may happen. It may be true, but it's also possible that the current regime is replaced by a hardline military government that's much more belligerent, that is much more determined to maintain a sort of revolutionary position, and it may not ultimately benefit us in the region. Now, it's also important to perhaps think about a scenario where if the regime is overthrown, Iran is engulfed in chaos for a period of time, and I don't think that benefits anyone in the region. Where Iran sort of implodes, there's no sort of ruling apparatus that emerges to replace the current regime, and Iran is thrown into a period of chaos that sort of reverberates across the region. That may be in Israel's interest in the short term, but whether it's in Israel's interest in the medium to longer term, I would say is an open question. So I would just say in response to the question of what comes next if the regime is overthrown, I would caution against wishful thinking and anticipating that whatever replaces the current regime necessarily will be pro-Western, pro-Israeli, or more open to taking a less hostile attitude towards us here in Israel.
Thanks, Brandon. There are a lot of additional questions, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. So we only have a minute left for me to thank you for your expertise and for sharing your knowledge so coherently and clearly, and for allowing us to see the situation in a much more nuanced and sophisticated way. We're really appreciative of that. All that remains to be said is that I wish everybody a quiet night here in Israel. Again, I'm grateful that no sirens interrupted our webinar tonight, and I'm hoping it will stay that way. And for everyone abroad, please stay in touch. We will let you know of other events and briefings like that in the near future. And once again, thank you very much, Brandon, and goodbye, everybody.
Thanks to everyone. Be safe.